Sure. Okay, I think we're going to get started. Thanks for coming to our panel today. How do we open source when we are all called ninjas? And why are we talking about this today? So we want to talk about sort of the notion of the cult of the developer. As developers, how do we navigate this world where our skills are in really high demand, but then we also get these really colorful superlatives that that kind of set up these interesting expectations when it comes to our workload, maybe compared to the balance of our personal lives or even work lives. So what we're going to do first is walk through our delightful panel, and then we'll get moving. So our first speaker is Alex Qin. She is a Brooklyn-based software engineer and educator. She's originally from Paris, France, not U.S. There's a couple in the country I'm sure you've been made aware of. And she ended up relocating to New York to study CS and fell in love with programming. She recently joined Skillshare's engineering team, where she works on their open education platform. Outside of work, she spends a lot of time thinking about how to make programming accessible to all. And she's currently teaching children and adults to code at ScriptEd, Women Who Code, and Technovation, and was also previously the curriculum director at Coalition for Queens, a free programming school for adults from diverse and underrepresented backgrounds in tech. And Alex, we'll start with, what are you excited about doing right now?
Thank you. Thank you, Tracy. What am I excited about doing right now? Well, as you said, I'm really passionate about creating more diverse and inclusive spaces within software. So I spend most of my time when I'm not programming teaching and mentoring diverse and underrepresented people to code. Yeah, I mean, I teach a lot of high school kids, and I'm really excited about figuring out ways to create curriculum for beginners that is like completely self-driven. So like that comes from like what they want to build, what they want to affect within their communities. Yeah, and very excited about like this ongoing conversation that people are having about how to like make programming and game development more inclusive, less ninja-based, and just like more of a safe space, especially for people who already feel perhaps like alienated within it.
Thanks, Alex. Our next panelist is David Huerta, and he is a web developer at DBRS Innovation Labs. He explores the intersection of art, technology, and whiskey. So David, what are you excited about working on right now?
So just a lot of different things. I am kind of slowly sinking into the world of machine learning, which is really exciting, which is really cool. I am excited to work on kind of other things, things that I talked about actually last time I was in this room on this side of the panel, dealing with kind of online privacy and how to make that more accessible to a broader number of people. So it's one of those things where, like, for the longest time, we've had, like, publicly available cryptography tools, but they are really only usable by technologists. And I think part of that kind of brings home the point to that good software is not just code. There's actually a lot more that goes into making something really great. And you don't have to learn to code to do those things. But, it's cool if you want to code as well. I do that, too.
Awesome. And our final panelist is Rachel White. She is a self-taught front-end dev at IBM Watson. She enjoys indie games, black cats, glitchy graphics, and horror movies. Rachel, what are you excited about working on?
Right now, I'm working on a magical girl stat bot for Twitter. So you'll tweet at it with like a certain phrase, probably like "transform me," and it uses image magic to generate a bunch of random stats with attributes and drawings. And I'm gonna open source it. That's pretty much all my personal projects. I make sure that they're open source because not only am I like going through a learning process of working on these things, I make sure it's like super well commented and really easy for anybody to like just grab something that I make and run with it. I'm also working on a talk with a bunch of demos for hardware modules. So if somebody wants to get into like microcontroller processes and stuff, they might just think of like a certain set of things that they could use with it. And I'm trying to find like all the weird things that they can do with it. And then like just pretty much trying to like get people to realize that even if they don't know how to do something, they should just try, because like by the time they figure it out, then they'll know and they'll be able to get other people to do stuff too.
Thanks. And I am Tracy Hinds. I'm your moderator for this panel today. And I am formerly at IBM Watson Health. And prior to that, I was at a company called Urban Airship out of Portland, Oregon. So the majority of my work in tech has been as a web engineer. But more recently, I was able to collide my outside world, which was a lot of community building in the JavaScript community, with my engineering work, and I've just started as the education community manager at the Node Foundation, Node.js, and that's really exciting for me because I get to combine a lot of my, I'd say, my love of intersections. So I love. I was a late bloomer in programming, self-taught and community taught, and I liked to nerd out on how people were learning to program, even as I was trying to learn it myself. And it turns out that now I get an opportunity to see how people are learning Node.js and make it better, because it's been quite a challenge for the programming language for new people to come on, because when the programming language began, it was very much senior engineers coming over from other languages. So we're trying to work on that, and that's really exciting. So if you like talking about education and programming, specifically curriculum building, I would love to talk to you. So that's enough of our intros, and we're going to move on to the meat of this thing. So when we're talking about this topic, we're thinking about sort of, I think we get at this aim of there's inherently organizational conflict in any company, whether it be at for-profit or non-profit, between business interests and developer interests. So you have people who are involved in different areas of an organization who may be the check writers, and those aren't necessarily the same people who are building or giving that input before it goes out to the world. And even sales is a very different area than the check writers. When you have that conflict, it's not bad per se. Conflict can be a really interesting way that progress can happen. But those challenges that we face, we feel on a daily basis, I think, in our work, is that how do we find balance in those when there's sort of an imbalance of power? So you might be able to give input, but when it comes to things like how we get started at that job in hiring, how we are onboarded, and how do we thrive in the workplace, we end up running into these organizational conflicts, especially in how we are perceived. So we're going to be talking about that today, and hopefully we can talk about how compromises to make everyone happy doesn't mean that as developers we are sort of being deprioritized as humans. So we're going to start at the beginning of this entire process for a developer, at least from the workplace environment, and we're going to talk about hiring. So in job postings and interviewing and hiring in general, how are we, how can we prepare our industry to succeed in hiring developers?
I think that a big problem that I've seen, that I've heard from other junior developers that are looking for jobs, a lot, not even the listings that don't call you a unicorn or like a rock star or a ninja, they're just somebody in the chain of management is like, we need a developer, let's get a recruiter, or let's tell HR to write these listings. So this one that I saw the other day for Adult Swim, they were looking for a web developer, and it was like must know current like technologies. So like it had JavaScript and it had PHP and it had I probably know it or something like that. It was like must know backend technologies, and I was like, okay, that seems reasonable. Must know iOS and Android, and I was like, but then it was like must know Unity, and must know, like, they want you to do front end, they want you to know back end, they want you to know mobile, and they want you to know games, which I'm sure there's some people that can cover all that, but to me it just felt like there was a disconnect in whoever wrote that job posting. And I think that if instead they have the teams that need the people to write job postings of what they need, then it might be easier to fill positions instead of just creating some kind of like email siphon of people sending in canned responses that aren't even reading it anyway.
I also find that there's oftentimes kind of like even when the job posting is like a little bit more realistic, like a disconnect between what's written on it and what is actually like looked for in a candidate. Like things like at least 5 years of experience with X programming language. Like when I talk to the actual hiring teams, they like make exceptions all the time for who they'll interview and who they'll talk to based on like who they're friends with or like recommendation from another programmer that they like, whose judgment they trust. And I feel like those job postings, when they have requirements like that aren't necessarily like hard lines, deter a lot of people from like even applying to jobs. And so we need to start thinking about like what are the actual like baseline requirements that we look for in engineers and not like the ideals or the nice to haves. Because I know a lot of people who get hired for great jobs who don't like match actually the job description.
Something to keep in mind too is just like kind of coming from the other side of like the person doing the hiring. So some of the challenges that come up in kind of in hiring and basically filling a specific need within a team is that sometimes, so we have this idea in software development, especially web development, of separation of concerns, where we have like the front end, the back end. These are kind of the descriptions of the job postings you might see. That works really well if like the code is separated so that one person can, you know, work on the front end and not have to deal with the back end. If sometimes though, and many times, you'll have this kind of like older code base that maybe wasn't built with the proper principles in mind of software architecture, so you have no choice but to hire a full stack developer. The other thing too is just like kind of, you know, having a sort of, you know, I guess structure or standards within the team's technology stack also works really well, because I know teams that have been like, oh, we have like, you know, 5 different front-end JavaScript frameworks for like these like 4 different projects because they want to do something cool in, you know, Angular or whatever. And so now we have Angular and React and like blah, blah, blah. And like, so it's one of those things where like, as kind of from the lead developer standpoint, you want to think about how those decisions might affect something else. It's be like, oh, well, now we're going to have to make sure, now we're going to limit the amount of the people that will apply to only people that feel confident enough to say, oh, well, this job description is Node.js, so I have to be like a Node.js expert. I'm like, no, that was like a one-time thing that doesn't even be maintained anymore. So something to keep in mind as far as like kind of looking at the software stack that you have and then kind of trimming it down to what you need, but also keeping standards, making it so that it's easier to hire people, which is always an important thing.
So do y'all feel that that the hiring teams are adequately equipped to be able to write the job requirements, even be doing these like sort of first rounds of even instruction to recruiters? Oftentimes there's an in-between.
Well, we could never afford recruiters where I was working at. So it was the kind of honest on this was just kind of placed on me to just kind of figure it out, which is fine because I had a lot more control and creativity and freedom to do that. So yeah, it was more of a matter of, and I can only, this is the only place that I've actually like, the Brooklyn Museum where I used to work at was the only place where I actually had the ability to hire people. So the process will be different. Might be different than what you've seen elsewhere. But yeah, it was one of those things where like we kind of took a look at, hey, what is everybody else doing wrong? Like, what could we do different? We looked at what we didn't want to do. It's kind of the thing first. Like, some companies will hire based on only like contributions to their open source code base first. Like, that's the first stage of the interview. The problem with that is if you look at the statistics of who actually participates in open source projects, not just who releases open source code, but who's actually actively in open source projects, the demographics are like very, very, very narrow. So you're limiting the diversity of your team just right off the bat by doing that. The other thing too is just like, if you're in Silicon Valley, you're competing with startups, you're competing with these other things that are like, hey, we'll pay you more, but like it's all kind of the same job description. There's always a ping pong table. There's always a keg. And it was like, what if we just like didn't, like, what if we just said like, we don't have a keg, we don't have a ping pong table, and then just see who that appeals to? So yeah, just it's like, and we're like, this 100-year-old art institution, so we have advantages. There's just like the first stage of the interview process is you come into the gallery and talk with us in the context of the thing that you're working for, which I thought was pretty cool. I don't know, I may have gone on a whole totally different tangent, but that was...
I actually got a job for calling out bullshit stuff in job requirements once. It was not in New York, because when I graduated school, I couldn't get a job in New York, so I had to leave the East Coast, and I moved to the Midwest. And in the Midwest, they don't care who you are or where you went to school. They're just like, this person knows design and development, let's hire them. And so that experience made me care a lot less about all of the requirements. But a lot of people aren't like that. Like, I think there's like somebody, I don't remember who said men will apply for a job if they're like 40 to 60% qualified, but women won't apply unless they feel 100% qualified. And I don't know, there's so many stigmas around and studies that have been done with like applicants for jobs, whether or not they're qualified or what their names are, and the perceptions that people get before they even get to that interviewing point. So like, while there is a problem with the way that like certain places write their hiring and stuff, I think that it's more than just bad job listings. I think that there's a lot of problems with like probably even internalized things that people that are hiring for those positions are looking at. But lately, in like the past few months, there's been a lot of, not the past few months, like the past few years, I've been seeing a lot more, not a lot more compared to like the cesspool of tech, but women and like other diverse groups trying to take away that stigma that happens with trying to get a job in tech.
At my company, Urban Airship, we were an organization of about 200, and they were really trying to bring more perspective into the organization from every type. I mean, it was just, they noticed that the founders were all like privileged cis white males, and they wanted to make a difference in that, and they recognized that because of the networks that they had, especially having grown up around Portland, Oregon, they didn't have, they needed to expand their worlds a bit. And so they tried to do that within the organization and found that they were really struggling. And it was sort of a complete overhaul that we ended up having to do. And it was talking to would-be candidates, not even candidates, and saying like, well, we're really fortunate that you applied or we're considering applying. Now tell us what's wrong with it. Tell us, like, we're lucky to get you to this point, but do you know friends who didn't apply to this job for this reason? And a lot of it did have to do with these sort of, copy and paste job postings where you see this very standard format. And again, it can end up discouraging people who come from underrepresented groups who aren't, I think, culturally trained to respond to a job application. And then there's also the flip side of this, which is a lot of companies, large organizations and smaller, even ours, that were using tooling for when someone submitted a resume that would sort of go through and check boxes of whether these candidates had met a certain number of requirements versus suggested.
Didn't that happen to you when you...
IBM Watson.
Yeah.
I had already finished my interview process, and the automatic resume runner, which I guess was so far back in the pipeline, didn't recognize that I had already been hired and told me I had been declined for an interview. So that was great. Yeah.
Just to piggyback off of what you said about the interviewing process, same thing with like recruiter events where it's just like a ping pong table and a keg. And like there's people that just like don't drink or don't want to be around people that are like, yeah, kegs and ping pong tables. So it's the whole process.
And David, I think we had chatted a little bit earlier about, we talk about all these, I think, these poor setups that we have in hiring, but I think we had a really good story as well about like a positive experience, especially coming from the top down in the way that you were approaching your hiring.
Right. So there were a lot of lessons that I learned from organizing an event called Art Hack Day that we kind of applied partially into kind of the makeup of our team at the Brooklyn Museum at the time. Namely, like we wanted, and this is something that I have to recognize and give credit to Arnold, who was our director at the time, for like bringing in this vision of a sort of more populist approach to an art museum that would represent the people that it was like surrounded by. So this was very much like kind of an extension of that in many ways, of like that vision permeating through the staff at the museum and then eventually reaching us and being like, we should think about this. So we looked at how people hired, and we wanted to like kind of reach out to a more broader community of people. So we started looking at like who was good at that. And thankfully, like in New York, we have plenty of communities that are very diverse, that have a good mix of people, a good mix of perspectives. We happen to know people that we were able to reach out to kind of put our feelers out with. If any of you know Tina Roth Eisenberg's community, kind of with Creative Mornings, in that community, within my own circles in Art Hack Day, within ITP, which is like a NYU program that I think is also partially here. So you were to like kind of look at that and then basically have a diverse set of applicants from the start. And we also wanted to differentiate ourselves from like the kind of generic startup that you see everywhere. And the museum itself is like really good at doing that just right off the bat. I mean, you walk by and the first thing you see is like banners on the side for like the Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art and Kehinde Wiley like show or whatever. So it's one of those things where like that was kind of our identity to begin with, which is really good because we had that foundation that we just kind of like piggybacked on top of. And we also had these communities that were started by other people, Brett Burns, Tina Roth Eisenberg, et cetera, that were already kind of doing the work of community building and then creating like diverse communities for us. So we basically just like reached out specifically to them. We didn't really go with recruiters or like posting on Hacker News or asking people to contribute to an open source project. We did do code reviews on apps for like code samples that they've done, but then, that would just be a way of like making sure that we don't repeat mistakes with the legacy code that we ended up with. And that worked out pretty well. Like close to the end of my tenure, we had like 50-50 male-female ratio. It was a small team, so it's not like a huge accomplishment, but I thought it was great, so turned out well.
Yeah, I've at my team at Skillshare, we've had similar kind of successful hiring diverse candidate history recently. I joined about 6 months ago. There was one female engineer on the team. She's amazing, and with our most recent hires, we're like 45% female male now, and I think a big part of that was the leadership decided about a year ago that they set a goal. They decided we're gonna get to 40% female engineering team, and I think that's like probably the most important thing when deciding to create a more diverse and inclusive team is like actually setting a goal, because then you're not giving yourself the option of not meeting it. Then you do the work. Then you do outreach to like communities of underrepresented people. You sponsor events where those people go to. You get your name out there, and like some strategies that have worked really well are like having diverse team members at every step of the interview process. So it's a signal to all the people who come and interview that we are an inclusive and diverse team. Similarly, we've been putting on a lot of events that are about lessening the gender gap in tech. We sponsored documentary film screening about it. That was a huge success. We had like 120 female engineers show up. Sponsored a big hackathon, an all-female student hackathon. That was a really big success as well. And I think, yeah, the main point is like setting a goal and then doing like everything you can to meet it. And that's been really successful.
Yeah, I think it's clear that not every company is working on this in the same way, that we're really fortunate to be working at companies. I think it's maybe why we work at the places that we do, because they are actively working to make a difference and makes us feel comfortable and a part of that world. I also kind of want to touch on the flip side of that. So we've got the companies who are working hard, I think setting precedent for it, but it's also preparing people for, I think, what they're going to be experiencing when they're stepping into this world, either as career transitioners or, first job. They may not know what they're stepping into. And Alex, I know with your work in the boot camp for underrepresented groups, we talked a little bit prior about how we have to be careful when we're setting people up or encouraging them to be a part of this community, a part of this world, that we're managing expectations. Because while it can be a really incredible experience, really empowering, it can also be at times very discouraging if you are from an underrepresented group. So can you tell us a little more about like what you guys were working on and how you prepared them?
Sure, yeah. So I previously ran a programming school for adults from underrepresented backgrounds in tech, and the program lasted 6 months, and it was completely free, and it was part-time, so people could maintain their jobs. And the goal of the boot camp was to kind of like take a population that was representative of the population of New York, and so our pilot class was about 50% female, 50% immigrant, 50% without a college degree, 50% Black and Latino, and all of them, kind of like the average income of the class was like around the federal poverty line, and like take people who were like incredibly passionate about what technology could do, who didn't know how to code, and who just like were really dedicated and excited about like entering this world and transforming their community through code, and so. There were like challenges, as like learning to code is challenging, but also one of the main challenges we faced is like, as you said, how do we prepare these awesome, highly skilled, capable individuals to enter a field where they might be, or probably most certainly will be, kind of like alienated, undervalued, and potentially like feel pushed out of. And so we like employed a few different not necessarily tactics, but solutions. We talked a lot about things like imposter syndrome, unconscious bias, stereotype threat, had ongoing conversations about these and like what they might encounter at their future jobs. We had diverse speakers who are like successful professionals come and give talks about their careers, their own experiences. We put a mentorship system in place for like once they do get a job, someone who doesn't work at their company, but someone who's affiliated with the organization to just like check in with them, talk about what they're going through with them. We had a lot of conversations about like, things like growth mindset, trying to like distance like programming from like an inherent ability. And so that like if they did encounter a situation where they were expected to be a ninja, that they would know like that's not actually their job. That's not actually the reality. And I think we were pretty successful. It's hard to say now because the first class only graduated maybe like 6 months ago, but a lot of them had like huge success landing great jobs at companies like Pinterest and like BuzzFeed and OkCupid, and like I talk to them regularly, and I know like their experiences aren't perfect. But they have this support network. They have this basis of knowledge. They have the language to identify what's like happening to them, and they're encouraged to write about it and talk about it and like be agents of change in their community. And I think that was like probably the most important part of the programming bootcamp, which is like encouraging people to like acknowledge the problem and try and change it, rather than just like not talk about it, which I think a lot of other programming schools kind of do.
Yeah, I think I was talking to a director of engineering this week about their training program, and it's even upon like that's continuing education once you're in the company, and it was it was a bit of a hot topic because he was sharing how they were really trying to raise up female leadership within the company and trying to actively train them and get their skills where they had themselves had expressed that they had some concerns or weaknesses in. But they found that once they got them into the training programs, they had these training programs were extremely rigorous and not adapted for different skill levels. You just got thrown in the fire. And I tried to explain to him how, depending on the group that you grew up in, the environment that you were around when you were younger, if you fail at something, it's often the case that, unlike some people who will just try again because it's sort of like, oh, well, I failed, like I just need to keep going. A lot of underrepresented groups in the environments they grew up in, it's, I failed at something, I am bad at this, and I should not do it. And I know that I've read, yeah, go ahead.
You know what I'm going to say. The eye color psychology test that was done. Yeah.
Oh, share it.
Oh, you don't know? I seen the video. If you haven't seen this study, and as much as what's her name? Does anybody know who I'm talking about? No? Okay, so there's this woman that's from a small town in Iowa, and she was born in the 30s, and the day that Martin Luther King Jr. was shot, she was ironing a teepee to educate her like third graders on something. I don't remember what, but she decided that she wasn't going to do that, and she was going to educate the students on racism, and these are all white children. And so what she decided to do was she split them up by eye color and had all of the blue-eyed students sit in the front of the room and all the brown-eyed students sit in the back of the room. She called on the children with the blue eyes more. She gave them a little bit longer lunches. She found that they started doing better on tests than the children in the back of the room were. And then as the children in the front started to succeed more, they started treating the kids in the back worse. And this is only over the span of like 2 weeks. And then after the like 2 weeks was over, she had them switch. And she had the children that were in the back of the room sit in the front of the room. And she found that while they did judge the other children, they weren't nearly as harsh as the way that the children were before. And now she like goes around and does that to like try and show people that will not experience racism or any like discrimination, like what it feels like. And when she started doing that in like the 60s and 70s, people were like, how dare you put these white children through this? They're so stressed. And she's like, that stress is like nothing compared to stuff that other people deal with every day. And if you haven't seen it, it's, if you search for like psychological eye color, yeah, thank you. The video is really, really interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting spin on sort of like having to, the ultimate way of having to teach people empathy. And I think that's such an interesting problem, even when you're talking about hiring or if you're talking about continuing in the workplace and with these hires that we're trying to prepare for these circumstances. One last thing I wanted to talk about with the hiring process, and then we'll move on to sort of the onboarding and being in that environment even more so, is the idea of, I think David had touched on it a little bit, a lot of companies expect you to show your code, right? When you're at the beginning of a process, if you're not going to be doing like a take-home, they just want to see your open source code. And again, depending on the group that you're from, you may not have a lot of that. Or you may just not have been in a position or a job that allowed you to open source anything that you were working on. But something that occurred to me in developing this conversation, which I know could be very controversial, is that when when we're looking at candidates, we're looking at code. But are we looking at something like their online behavior? And I'm not talking about like their personal time on Facebook. I'm not going to Facebook stalk somebody. I know that was a lawsuit a couple of years back. A lot of companies were trying to do stuff like that. But more of their reputation, even in the online community. So we're not talking about maybe personal time on Twitter, but when they're talking about code, when they're making comments in open source projects, what do y'all think of considering that as part of the vetting of a candidate?
So when I was hiring, we did kind of different steps of this interview process. One of which was like we would ask for code samples. This is something that our team and I felt strongly about asking because of the fact that, like, I guess the way things were done before our time, like, it wasn't something, the quality of code wasn't really checked for us. So, and that's kind of how we ended up in this like legacy code base, which eventually like didn't really affect the person that built it, but like all of a sudden inherited it and now have like, 10 p.m. like phone calls of like, oh no, the database is down, that sort of thing, or like, the SCP process that is copying XML from one place to the other broke the XML and please fix it. Also, it's like 3 a.m. So that's one of those things that we were really wanting to have some way of like determining how well it would be at writing maintainable code is kind of like the top thing that we would look for. But it was something that we had to keep in mind that like not everybody has the ability to release the intellectual property of the code that they write. So like, I mean, luckily, like a lot of our applicants did have like a GitHub that we can kind of look at, or they would be like, yeah, check out this repo, or like, here's an example. Or like, the easiest thing is actually like, hey, I built something with your API, which we have, which was a really useful thing for that. And that was great. But yeah, there would be times where it'd be like, somebody worked for like a defense contractor or something. They can't do that without like, can't show that code without like going to jail. So it's important to keep in mind, and like some of the best developers that I know have actually like never released code online. So yeah, it's something that we have mixed feelings about, but it's one of those things that like it's make exceptions and then find another way to like find code quality if they can't do that.
I get anxiety if somebody is like, this is due to like bad previous experiences with jobs and stuff, but like if someone's like, well, it's different for open source, but if I have to like pair with someone in an interview, or if I have to whiteboard stuff, I freak out. Like if I'm working with someone and I have to pair with them, it's no problem. But as soon as you're like judging me, I'm like, no. And I know I'm not the only one. But for like GitHub open source stuff or whatever comments they have, I think that it's fine to look at those things. I would argue that not Facebook because that's private, but like if someone uses their real name on like Twitter or something and they're representing themselves as a developer and then they're like saying anything negative, I would use that as a guide for like bad stuff, because if you're going to represent yourself that way and it's not like, and you're not like dumb enough to be an egg with like being rude or something like that, then like that's how you want to be seen.
Yeah, I think this question is very self-serving for me because I've had some bad experiences with colleagues, former colleagues, and I was hungering for a way to be able to better screen. So many of the challenges that we face in the coding world is people related. It's the human challenge. It's much harder to gauge and quantify, even qualify or quantify. So a lot of times I kind of wonder how people are testing for collaboration, right? If you work in a collaborative environment, which many of us do, and you have a colleague who is completely incapable of doing so, completely incapable of being able to work with, other people, even if it's just for pull request review, that's going to be a complete stop. It's gonna cause blockers to getting your work done at all.
It only takes one bad experience like that for someone to like have it dwell on them for a long time.
I agree that measuring someone's like ability to work with other people is like so important in hiring and interviewing, and something that I think we do really well at Skillshare. We have like a pretty involved interview process, and I really like it. Not that it's like very difficult, like it's the right amount of challenge technically, but like we also have like a culture piece of the interview, and people who aren't on the team that you're going to join kind of like ask you questions about like your work history, your like just drill into like what we call our company values, like humility, passion for excellence, like adaptability, things like that, and ask you questions that like try to identify, do you work well with people? Like, for example, like, and they sound like silly like interview questions, but we like go into them like deep for like an hour, so that like we really try to identify if this person has run into a conflict with another person, like were they able to be introspective and learn from that, like, or do they like fault everyone else around them? I also think like because we conduct many rounds of interviews with like many different people, like, and then do like a full retrospective with everyone, like if there are any red flags, like this person was looking at my chest the whole time, or like, this person said something offensive, like we're able to catch those more easily. But I don't think you can necessarily judge all of that from someone's like Twitter presence. Like it's hard. It's like, firstly, I don't know if that would necessarily be that fair. I mean, I've often wondered if my Twitter presence is off-putting to potential like employers, because it's like very much like social justice warrior type Twitter profile, and I'm like, well, if someone doesn't agree with this, like I don't want to work for them anyway. But it's a difficult line.
The last thing you said, I'm the same way, but I know that I have like the privilege to be like, if somebody doesn't like, there's way worse stuff on my Twitter that's not like offensive, but if like an HR company saw it, they would be like, what the, take IBM out of your Twitter profile. But
Yeah.
I'm just weird though.
No, that's, I don't think you should, especially because we're living our worlds, right? We live our worlds online. We have friends that we may have never met in person. It's hard to say, your personal life and your professional life should be, like, that's impossible, right? You don't want to have your work either, getting hired or, staying at your job. You don't want that to be a challenge for, just being able to be happy in work and at home. I think there might be a balance. You have to be careful because as developers, we tend to do a lot of development outside of work, even on our own time that has nothing to do with work. But with open source per se, you've got these worlds that can collide really quickly. And sort of what you do there. Sort of getting back to that, when you're talking about being in the workplace, you're talking about navigating these colleagues and how we handle communication. We've got these people who may have been hired as ninjas or expected to be the 10x developer, which in itself is not, it's a controversial practice. And I think many people are kind of getting to the point where they'll say that it's not a good practice. But, sort of like how do we, what can we do even as developers now to, in our current work, to encourage or discourage the idea of the 10x program, or can we reframe it?
I mean, I think one thing that we've been doing at Skillshare, obviously I love the culture at my company, it's pretty amazing, I feel really lucky, that really encourages the breaking down of that 10x developer thing, is we we put a big emphasis on knowledge sharing. Like, we're an education company, so obviously we care about like educating ourselves and each other. But like everyone on the engineering team, each person is like meant to share something, share like some knowledge with the rest of the team at some point or another. So every week, someone on the team will lead what we call a skill share, in which they like teach everyone else like about some new programming thing they learned or about one area of the code base that they recently worked on. And it's essentially like nothing is like too small, nothing is too trivial to teach others. And it's really about the idea that like there's not a 10x person. There's not someone who knows everything, and like you have knowledge to contribute, even if you just joined the team, even if you just graduated from, I don't know, a programming boot camp, or you know, it's your first job as a programmer. So that's a practice that we do that I really like.
I guess I've always just like been more focused on building 10x teams and just hiring 10x developers, and I think a lot of that involves more looking at complementary skill sets, complementary like perspectives and practices on things, and like less so the just sort of like, look at this rock star. Although, I guess disclaimer, like where I work now, we did actually hire an actual rock star to do like code stuff. So Aaron Nance, he plays piano for the Beirut and the National. Was like working with me for a little while. It was pretty cool.
That's allowed though, I think.
Yeah. We haven't hired any like actual ninjas, or maybe we did, but they've just been so sneaky that I haven't spotted them in the office yet. But yeah, it's one of those things where like in hiring, like I really am just like a deep skeptic on a lot of things. So just like anybody that would seriously call themselves a 10x developer or a ninja or a rock star, I'm just like immediately, instantly, just like I'm gonna be looking at your GitHub so hard after that and just like judging every line of code based on that new standard that you gave me. So it's just something that keep in mind. And yeah, like I said, I think the output of a team is more important because I think like there's only, you know, so much people can actually, like you have two hands to type on, like, you know, there's only so much a 10x developer can do as far as like actually, you know, creative output, et cetera. So just like having the team as a whole be like, you know, work together really well, I think is a higher priority in my opinion, but yeah.
I think my friend, he may have borrowed it from somebody else, but my friend Wilman Duffy just gave his first talk, and it was really great, and it was about a more empathetic pull request process. And it was really incredible, and he had this excellent illustration of a 10x bot. And you could make the 10x bot really sad if you were being mean in your pull requests. But what was interesting was he had kind of reframed it as a 10x developer. The only 10x developer he wants to work with is a 10x developer in that they raise up the entire team. So they might be a more experienced programmer, but they're also really skilled at being able to teach and being able to help these best practices get adopted, not only in the communication and code itself, but just helping people grow as an employee. And I think that you would hope that of your managers too. So I call it, you know, maybe managing up a little bit in that we can all help each other, including our managers, kind of learn these skills. So hopefully that whole 10x thing will go away in general, but if you're going to do it, it's that you're growing the whole team in that instead of just the one person, that one rock star ninja. And I think Caroline was just having us wrap up. Did you want us to do Q&A, or are we good for time?
We can do about like 5 minutes of Q&A.
Okay, all right.
Anyone from the audience have any questions?
Just get a coffee break. Yeah. All right, thank you guys so much for listening. Yeah.